Welcome to the supplementary video for Chapter 12, Organizational Diversity Processes. Remember to give this list a good look so you know what you're expected to understand from this chapter. The modern workforce continues to reflect the dramatic demographic changes that began many years ago in this country. Women continue to join the workforce in increasing numbers and are expected to outnumber men in the workforce by the year 2020. Nearly 40% of the American workforce identifies as a member of a minority group, and America is on track to be a majority-minority country in the very near future. That means that minorities will represent a majority of the overall population. So diversity is simply a fact of modern organizational life. And if you're going to be successful in organizations, both professionally and personally, you need a good understanding of organizational diversity. Our chapter reviews some of the basics, including awareness of prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination, as well as two aspects of federal legislation that are important for their impacts on organizational diversity: the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Plus, we'll look at some of the opportunities and challenges of developing a diverse organization. First, we have to be aware of prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination, all of which are still part of modern organizations, and things that can sneak up on us if we're not careful. It may be rare to witness overt sexism or racism, but there are still many covert or hidden forms of prejudice and discrimination. Some that might be intentional, but others that are not. Prejudice and discrimination can become embedded within organizational systems themselves, like the hiring and promotion practices of an organization, such that well-intended people who would never consider themselves sexist or racist can unknowingly participate in discriminatory systems. For example, consider an organization that prefers promoting people within the organization for top executive jobs, rather than hiring from outside the company. It's not some formal rule, but over time it's just a cultural norm that developed as executives promoted people they were familiar with, resulting in an executive team of primarily white males. It's not like we're trying to discriminate, they might say. It's just that there haven't been any qualified female or minority candidates for these top executive positions. But if that company does not do a good job of recruiting and hiring women and minorities to begin with, they will inevitably have a skewed pool of applicants for top executive positions. Of course, they're not intentionally discriminatory, but this didn't happen by accident either. If you aren't intentional about developing organizational diversity, it won't simply happen by chance. Because as we've seen throughout the previous chapters, organizations are not neutral sites, and decision-making is always constrained and subject to biases. So please don't make the mistake of saying, well, I'm personally not sexist or racist, and thus write off the whole diversity issue because you don't think it's relevant for you. There's no neutrality here. Either we're moving away from or towards diversity. And even as we achieve more diversity, it still takes active, intentional efforts to sustain organizational diversity. Two important pieces of federal legislation you should be aware of that directly impact organizational diversity. First, the Americans with Disabilities Act ensures that workplaces will be safe and accessible for all levels of ability. Reasonable accommodations must be made for disabled workers. And it's not just the physical infrastructure, like elevators and bathrooms. In our increasingly digital society, this has huge implications, because digital content must also be accessible regardless of physical ability. Imagine taking this online class if you were blind or deaf. Those physical disabilities should not prevent you from furthering your education, so we do a lot of extra stuff to make the course content available for everyone. Second, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act aims to ensure that people cannot be discriminated for employment based on sexual orientation or gender identity. This law has been introduced in the U.S. Congress several times since 1994, but technically has never been passed. Most recently in 2013, it passed the Senate, but it died in the House. We don't know the future of this law, but it's fair to say that legislation is certainly moving in this direction. Several states do have their own version of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, but it is yet to achieve federal approval. Currently, it is illegal at the federal level to discriminate for employment based on race, gender, religion, military status, national origin, pregnancy, or disability. Finally, what are some of the main challenges and opportunities of developing diverse organizations? Diversity definitely brings more difference into organizations, and difference certainly can result in conflict. But there is so much more to gain from organizational diversity. Not only is it simply the morally right thing to do, diversity also helps improve organizational effectiveness, what people call the business case for diversity. Take a look at this chart from your textbook, which summarizes the key arguments in favor of organizational diversity from a business organizational perspective. Overall, diversity is simply a fact of modern life. It's the morally right thing to do, and it will enhance organizational effectiveness and success. As we wrap up, be sure to review this chart that explains how diversity would be considered across the various approaches to organizational communication we've been learning about. And look at the questions at the end of the chapter for things to talk about on our discussion board this week. Next up in Chapter 13, we'll look at technological processes of organizational communication.